Greetings and welcome to the Meteor application template. I'm going to do a walkthrough of the application. And the goal of this application is to provide you with some boilerplate, both in terms of the directory structure and the files and some of the extension packages that enable you to start building simple Meteor applications more quickly. This is what the home page looks like. The boiler or this template is going to include support for Iron Router and examples of the use of Iron Router, AutoForm for forms, the accounts package, and Twitter Bootstrap. We're going to implement simple authorization and authentication and a settings file and configuration approach so that you can have a set of settings for development and a set of settings for deployment. Okay, so hopefully if you use this template, you'll be off and running and able to get your basic app built more quickly. Usage involves, of course, you need a Meteor installed. Next step is to create a new GitHub repository at GitHub, clone it into your local workspace, and then to get the template code into your new GitHub repo where your application is going to be developed. There's a few ways to do it. One way is to basically set up the template repo as an upstream repo and then fetch and merge it. Okay. Once that's done, you should be able to just type meteor -- settings and then the path to the development settings file from the top level of your repo. And if all goes according to plan, your application will appear at localhost 3000. And you can log in using the credentials in settings.development.json. So I've got a running version of the template right here at localhost 3000. If I'm not logged in, this is the only page you can see. So to log in, I'll use the credentials in the settings.development file. And after I've done that, you can see that there are now two new menu items that are available to me because I'm authenticated. And one of them is to list the stuff. So this application implements a collection called stuff. It's initialized with two stuff documents indicating the name of the stuff and how much of the stuff we have. So one thing we can do is we can create a new stuff. Let's say we now have 10 unicycles, and when we submit that form, you can see in our list stuff page we've now got that that entry. If we decided we really, we get a few more unicycles, maybe now we have 15, we can press the update button and we go to the list page, and now we have 15 of these things. There's no delete. That would be a cool thing to add to this application, maybe another column right here that says delete, just as an exercise to make sure that you understand how the code works. So that's all this thing does, and of course we can sign out, and now we can't get back to any of those pages. So like that list page, it says we're not authorized. We can go to the home page. So that's all it does. But there's a fair amount of stuff that goes into creating that. So let's look at this in a little more detail. The first thing is the top level directory structure, and there's three top level directories. There's a config directory, a doc directory, and an app directory. The config directory is going to hold configuration files, some that would be committed to the repo, such as settings.development.json. You may also have a deployment configuration file like settings.production.json that you might have in that directory, but you don't commit it to your repo because that would contain credentials that are secret. Okay, so the gitignore file actually ignores the config/settings.production.json file so that doesn't get committed. And then the final kind of top level file is a JSHint file for that static quality assurance. Okay, so that's the three top level directories. And there's a doc directory for screenshots and so forth. But in the app directory, that's where most of the stuff is. We're going to have three top level directories: a client directory, which is going to hold client-side code, a lib directory, which is going to hold code for both client server side, and because it's named lib, is going to be loaded first before any of these other things, and then a server directory, which is going to hold server-side code. Inside the client side, we'll have a style sheets for our custom CSS, and we have a templates directory with templates for the application as a whole, and then for our home page, and then for the various pages associated with our stuff collection. lib will provide the definitions for accounts, our stuff collection, the routing between the different pages, and the accounts stuff. And then the seeds subdirectory under server is going to define the initialization for both stuff and our accounts. So I think this is a reasonably good directory structure. Obviously, in your own application, you'll rename stuff, or you'll delete it and have other subdirectories for your own collection objects for whatever you're doing. Okay. The next thing is that this package comes defining a bunch of additional packages, and basically we define a few different extensions for the use of form processing. In particular, we use AutoForm, which I find to be a convenient way to do form processing in Meteor, and we'll go into that in a little more detail. We're going to use the accounts, that's a mistake, it should be accounts UI and accounts UI Bootstrap 3. I'm sorry, accounts password and accounts UI Bootstrap, which is just the accounts UI package with some extensions to support Bootstrap presentation of the account stuff, validation or authentication. For routing, we'll use Iron Router. For presentation, we'll be using Twitter Bootstrap and this thing called Spin when there's time that's required for getting collections. And for coding, we're going to add a couple packages, including underscore and eJSON. Note that the auto-publish and insecure packages are not included in this application, so you shouldn't be using you'll be using Meteor methods, and you will have to use publish and subscribe. Okay. A couple notes here. At the time that I built this, it seemed to me that some of these dependencies weren't set up correctly, requiring me to explicitly add the eJSON and check packages. If they fix these, it really doesn't matter that much to you, because in fact they're already in this package as well. But I just, for a kind of note to self kind of thing, I added that in. Okay, so as I went through before, there's these 4 pages. There's a home page that is at the top of this README, plus these 3 internal pages for listing, adding, and editing stuff. And that's all there is to the application. Let's look at start by looking at our definition of the stuff collection. So that's in this file here, app lib collection stuff. So this is both on client and server side. And this should look pretty normal. I define a variable for this string so I don't misspell it, because I reference it a fair number of times. I define the Mongo collection. I've got Meteor methods because I don't have the insecure package in my application. So I have one Meteor method which is going to be run by AutoForm when a new stuff document is created with the add stuff form. And I have another Meteor method when I have to edit an existing one, and that looks like this. And it's basically pretty, 2 lines, pretty straightforward. I have to publish and subscribe explicitly, so the publication occurs in this file. Subscription is going to be happening in the router file, and I publish the entire contents of the stuff collection, which is pretty simple. Now here's where things get a little more fun, which is that when we use AutoForm, the best way to use AutoForm is to define a schema for our documents. And here's an example of doing that. We use the simple schema package, which is a dependency of the AutoForm package, and we can say that a stuff document consists of a name and a quantity, and we provide some additional information about the type of each of these things, which is kind of cool, which enables AutoForm to do validation at the time of form submission. And then there's also kind of an AutoForm specific stuff that we can add to this. So we provide a placeholder, and then when we actually look at the form, there'll be a legend field that's got the name stuff. Okay, and you can go to these pages inside AutoForm to see more about that. So that's the definition of the collection, and then we initialize it in app server seed stuff.js, and so we create a variable containing a couple instances of stuff, and then when we bring up the application, we basically check to see is there any stuff in our collection. If there's no stuff in the collection, then we iterate through our array of stuff instances and insert them. So that's pretty straightforward. For CSS, we're going to use Twitter Bootstrap. In order to do that, we install two packages called the Twitter Bootstrap package and this extension, so that accounting, the login and logout form is styled with Twitter Bootstrap stuff. And most of the Bootstrap stuff is in App Client Templates application. And so first, the best way to look at this is to first look at the layout, which is kind of the top level template, and you can see that we're going to include a header template, and then we'll put the kind of the body inside here, and then we'll have a footer template. Okay, so what do those header and footers look like? Well, here's the header template, and it's basically the nav bar. Okay, that I won't highlight the whole thing, but basically it's the nav bar, and you can see there's some link stuff which we'll come back to later. It's an inverse nav bar, that's why it shows black, and it's fixed to the top of the page, which I'll get to in a second. But before I get there, I'll just show you, here's what the footer template looks like. You may or may not need a footer, I don't know. Because the application implements this fixed nav bar at the top, we have a style sheet in app client style sheet style.css, where we define a top padding for the body of 70 pixels, basically, so that the body comes down below that nav bar. And if you work with Twitter Bootstrap and fixed top, this is really standard kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the layout stuff. Obviously, I assume you kind of know your way around Twitter Bootstrap for this. We're going to use Iron Router for our routing package. I know that there's other alternatives out there, but Iron Router at this time is the most popular, and most of the examples on the for Meteor uses Iron Router, so I figured that's the simplest thing for folks to use to get up to speed. Almost all the routing stuff is defined in app-lib-router-router.js, and it's really pretty simple. We're going to use this layout template, and we're going to wait for the subscribe call to return, and in the process we'll use this loading template that just shows that spinner thing while the subscription is going along. And then we have these 4 pages that are shown right here. So we have a top level page which is going to route to the template called home. We have a list page which routes to the template called list stuff, an add page which routes to the template named add stuff, and then if we want to edit something, we have a stuff and then with the actual ID, and we populate this with the actual document associated with that. There's no error checking in this. There should be, but for this boilerplate code, since you're going to be ripping all this stuff out anyway, I decided that I wouldn't put in all the error checking. But clearly, if someone could type into the address bar some bogus ID and you won't find it in the database, and you'd like to display something better than whatever this application returns. But you can go through the examples of Iron Router and find all sorts of simple code to do that. So how do we use the routing? One place is in the nav bar. So you can see we use this path for home to provide a link in the brand on the left hand side to the home page. And then if we're logged in, and I'll get to that in a minute, then we display these links. And again, we use this path for thing so that we just provide the name of the route, and it will figure out what that route actually is for us. Again, pretty simple. And then the other thing that's kind of cool, if you remember, when we actually, after submitting one of those forms, we jumped to the list page. So how did we do that? That's pretty simple. If we go to the stuff page, you can see that there's here's the add stuff template, and then there's an add stuff.js, which I've associated with it to just put in the following, to define the following hook function for autoform, which says, given the add stuff form, and we can see that the add stuff form is defined, that's the ID. So it's going to use the form ID here. Okay, so that's how it decides what hook, where this hook is, what form this hook is going to be attached to. And on success, when the submission is success, then we just tell it, we tell it to invoke the router go function and go to the page named as list stuff. So it's, hard to think of an easier way to implement that. And that's how we get this this movement routing to move to the list stuff page after we successfully submit a form. That's a pretty common pattern. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our forms. We're using AutoForm, kind of a complicated package, but once you kind of understand it, I surely don't understand it completely, but I understand it enough to know that it can save a lot of time and a lot of code, a lot of lines of code, if you use it. So as I kind of talked about before, the first step to using AutoForm is to define the schema, because AutoForm is going to basically, for example, check to make sure that the types of all values in the form are correct and use the bootstrap error validation stuff. Okay. In addition, it'll use this information to help support the layout. Okay, so that's one spot that we're going to use that AutoForm exploits, and then we use this quick form component, which is the kind of the first suggested way to lay out forms, for this template that seemed more than adequate. So here's an example of how you do it. You say I'm going to invoke the quick form component, and I tell it about the collection I want to implement. I tell it that I want the horizontal bootstrap form layout. I even tell it, kind of the classes that it should associate with the labels and the input columns. Because remember, the horizontal thing puts the labels and then a row of labels and then a row of the fields associated with the labels. So you got to tell it how much space you want for each of those. And then I give it the form ID. I tell it I'm using method-based Meteor methods, not the insert the insecure method or insert deny. And here's the name of the Meteor method I'm going to invoke, and then when it's a successful addition, I'm going to reset the form. Okay, so there's that one, and if we look at the edit stuff thing, you can see it's almost exactly the same. The only difference is the form ID has changed. We're using the method update type. We invoke a different method. We have to pass the document that we want to pre-fill the form with, the document that we're actually editing, and then we can tell it what the button is. And all this stuff at the top, the reason why I kind of split into two parts, this is exactly the same for both the add and the edit side. Okay, so that's a whirlwind use of forms. Okay. The next thing we do in this package is we support authentication. So you can't do anything without logging in. And that's using the accounts package in Meteor, and we extend it with the accounts UI package with a bootstrap flavor. And the one thing I wanted a place to show where you might do account configuration. That should occur in the lib directory under accounts config, and all I did was just say that when you do sign up, you just have to supply a username. You don't have to supply an email or any of that stuff. So I just showed how that code might look, and since it only executes on the client side, I kind of guard it with the Meteor is client. So that's one aspect of authentication. And when the application is run for the first time, if you pass the settings file, we actually the way this application works is there's in our development settings, we have this default account field with kind of publicly accessible data, a username and a password. And since this is actually committed to GitHub, as you can see right here, this is clearly, not passwords we would use in production, right? So the standard kind of design pattern is that you'll have a settings.development.json where you configure your system with whatever credentials or whatever you want, in a public way, and that's committed to GitHub. And then you'll also have a file called settings.production.json, which is not committed to GitHub. And in fact, as I noted before, in git ignore, you can see we ignore that file. Okay, and that would be where you would store the credentials that you don't want users to know about. Okay. Okay, and so if we go into this app server seeds account.js, you can see this code runs every time the system starts up, and it checks to see whether or not there are any Meteor users defined. And if there aren't any defined, then it further checks to make sure that you passed a settings file. And if you pass the settings file, then it actually creates that particular user for you. Otherwise, it prints something out to the console that says, you didn't pass the settings file, so we don't have any users. Okay, and you can always use the register link on the pull-down menu on the nav bar, and you could register a new user if you wanted. So it's not the end of the world if a predefined user isn't defined, but I just tried to show you the code that supports that. Okay, so authentication is validating who is actually manipulating the app, and the way you do that is by login. The second step is authorization, which is deciding of those people who are logged in, which ones can access any particular page. And so this template application implements a really simple strategy which says if you're logged in, you can see and manipulate all of the stuff data. So you can access any of those three stuff pages, the list stuff, the edit stuff, and the add stuff page. Of course, you might want to have roles. You might want to have an admin role and a user role and allow different pages or different templates and so forth to be accessible to each. That's kind of a simple enhancement to this basic boilerplate code. So the way we do this, there's a few different ways you can do it, and I am following the recommendations in the Flow Router guide, which says that authorization logic should be implemented at the template level. And even though we're using Iron Router, we can follow that particular design pattern no problem. And so I decided to do that both because they seem to have a persuasive argument that that's the right way to do it, and also if you're using this boilerplate code and at some point in the future you decide to move to Flow Router, you've implemented the authorization logic the right way. Okay, so how do you do that? It's pretty cool, I think. You have this template called if logged in, which is going to check to see if authorization is actually in progress and is going to display something. Otherwise, if everything's okay, it's going to display whatever the template that's being wrapped within this template. Otherwise, if they're not logged in, you get a message saying you can't see the page. Okay, and let's see how. And then we need a couple helper functions: the authorization auth in progress, auth in process helper, which returns the value for Meteor logging in, and a can show helper, which just says is true or false depending upon whether or not a Meteor user is defined. Okay, so that's how we define this if logged in template. How do we use the if logged in template? Okay, well, let's go to this template, the add stuff template. What we do is we wrap, our code for actually displaying the form in this if logged in template. Simple as that. Okay, so now this form will only be displayed if the user is logged in. And that exact same thing occurs for edit stuff. We have the if logged in template wrapping, and for list stuff, again, if logged in. Okay, so that's pretty good. How we prevent the unauthorized access. Okay, initialization configuration. I kind of went over this before. Generally, when you bring up an application for the first time, you want to put some seed data in it, and so I have a seeds directory with this. Here's how we seed the accounts, and here's how we seed the stuff. So we've seen that already. Finally, quality assurance. And then as I told you before, the gitignore file excludes settings.production.json, so you can basically initialize your system differently in production than during development, presuming you have this file someplace and you don't commit it. For quality assurance, right now I can show you JS hint. So we have a JS hint RC file. The most interesting thing about this is that we define a whole lot of globals, not only the globals for the Meteor top-level stuff, but also the globals associated with routing and accounts and so forth, and underscore and jQuery. And then even at the bottom, we define a global called stuff capitalized and a global called stuff not capitalized, which is our collection, and we'll probably want to you know, if you're using this as your template, this is one piece of code you'll definitely want to be editing because you'll have different collections. So that's the overview of the file, and I hope it's of use to you.